So, I guess, Will, I've made you a co-host, so you can start whenever you would like.
Okay, great.
It's 7:02. So before Will starts up, I'll just say for anybody listening on and watching on Facebook, I'll be monitoring the Facebook comments to see if anybody has questions. So just ask in the comments if you have any questions. And Dave, I'll get you to do what you normally do.
Okay.
Dave McMahon.
Can do.
Dave will be monitoring the Zoom chat. So if you're new to this whole process, at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on a mobile device, it's if you tap on the screen, there should be a little chat option pop up. If you click on that and make sure you're chatting to everybody, you can ask questions there. Or the way things have gone in the last little bit, if anybody has a question, they just ask. So just during Will's presentation, if you could just mute your microphones so that any background noises and whatever don't affect things. So, okay, Will, take it away.
Thank you very much. So tonight I'm going to talk about applying Waterslide decals to models. I specify Waterslide decals because dry transfers are a whole other category that require a whole different set of preconditions and a whole different treatment. They're just a whole different process. And Waterslide are by far the dominant medium of decals. I haven't used a dry transfer in probably 20 years. Time was that we did, mainly because we could only get the stuff we wanted in those. Anyway, so Waterslide decals are, like the name implies, they're a decal process that involves water to separate the film that carries the ink with all the markings from the backing paper. They usually come on a sheet such as this sheet. Is that too bright? That's too bright.
It is a little
Yeah, change the light a bit.
maybe just move it closer to the camera.
Yeah, we'll see if that works. So there's your typical Waterslide decal sheet. This is a highball graphics set. Actually, I'll put the other camera. I'll put it on the other camera. Go to the worm cam. So this is a set of Waterslide decals. This one happens to be from Highball Graphics.
Oh yes,
an excellent decal producer in West Ossipee, New Hampshire. I recommend them highly. They're my go-to these days. Waterslides are pretty much all the same, although older decals such as Microscale, to this day, in fact, and the older Harold King, or what's the other manufacturer? There's Harold King, and there's a third one I can't name offhand. But the older decal process, the older decal manufacturers used a silk screen process, where they silk screened the ink on to the paper, and then laid the film on top of that. And very often you see those they're often spot printed, so the film is only around the markings. And sometimes the film's over the whole sheet. That's what Microscale does. Now those decals, they're the older process. They are very robust, so they're very difficult to tear, and they're very difficult to damage. The downside is they tend to be a little thicker. Now, manufacturers, more recent manufacturers like Highball, they use an inkjet printer process, like the old Alps printers that Kodak bought the rights to. I'm not sure who's manufacturing them now, but that process, lay down the film on the paper first and then print over it with the ink. Now that's important because with the ink on top of the film, that means if you hit, any abrasion to that is going to dig through that ink pretty quickly, and it's going to damage the decal. So you got to be a little careful handling them. But the payoff is they're much thinner. The process is much less expensive, and therefore we get a wider variety of decals in those style. Highball use a inkjet printer process. I'll start with surface preparation. I have here a model that I've already got ready. I actually didn't paint this model, somebody else did, and I ended up with it. It's already been painted nicely with scale coat. You can see the nice shiny finish, nice 3/4 gloss finish that scale coat is famous for. That gloss finish is vital to good decal application. I cannot stress that enough. If you think if you look at your model and you say, That's probably enough. That's probably glossy enough. It's not glossy enough. It has to be, no doubt. Now, you can use just glossy paint, but a lot of the paints that we use are flat paints because that's what we get to match our stuff. So for that, you need a clear coat. Now, over just about everything, my clear coat of choice, second here, my clear coat of choice is this material, Pledge Fuller Finish. You all see that? Can everybody see that? Yes, no?
Yeah, we got it.
Okay. So this used to be sold under the brand name Future. It's the same material, and it's not a floor wax. It is a transparent gloss acrylic finish. Every now and again, this comes up that newer modelers don't know about this stuff. It's a very long-standing material. I started using it in the middle '80s. I had models at one point sitting around here that were 25, 30 years old that have been coated with that and no trace of deterioration. So that applied right out of the bottle through an airbrush can give you a nice glossy coat. It takes a little getting used to using it. It's very, very thin, thinner than regular paint. But once you get the hang of it, it's very fast drying. It's very hard, and it's very what's the word I'm looking for? Inert. It does not react with anything else, which makes it really great because some paints and clear coats don't mix well with others. Now we'll talk afterwards about what you do after the decal. But so before the decal, you need a glossy finish on the model. Once you've done that, it's time to start applying decals. As always, I've got a trusty reference photo here. I've actually got a picture up. I actually have another one here somewhere. Oh, there it is. I have one on my computer screen too. I like having a printed photo of something I'm doing specific. I find it's a little easier to deal with. And if something comes, if for whatever reason I can't look at the JPEG, then I've got that right there. Also, but I still have the computer image because I can zoom it. The first thing, I'll throw the decal in some water. Just let that sit for a couple seconds. And it is only a couple seconds. I'll talk about why momentarily. And we put it on the model. And you'll notice the first thing I do is I'm working it gently with this micro brush. I'm trying to get it where I'm not too much on the ink or I'm not excessively handling it. Back to that scratching. That's why I use a micro brush. Now I'm going to pin it in place with the micro brush. And I'm going to pull the paper out from underneath it. And the micro brush is going to stick to it. Shazbot. That's okay. A little water. So now that I've got this on, we'll talk a little more about what I'm doing here.
It's good that something messed up, Will, because then it shows people.
That's totally not messing up. That's just typical decal behavior.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. These things are it takes a certain getting used to. Now, back to the process. What I did there is I just inserted my decal into water. The water soaks through the paper and breaks the bond between the film and the paper. So the decal starts to float off. You immediately take it out, leave it on the paper. You don't want that decal off the paper until it's on the model because otherwise it'll twist around and get tangled up. Nothing less fun than untangling a decal. I do it at least 3 times on every model I build. So it's always the little decals. So once it's on the model, all that's happening here is it's working on much the same principle as privacy film you put on Windows. What you're getting is because you got this glossy finish, which means smooth. What you're getting is almost a capillary bond, I'd call it, between the materials. So what we're doing is the water is now laying between the decal and the paint and providing flotation. It's also excluding air if we've done it right. So as we work on this, the water lets us move the decal around until we get it exactly where we want it. And as it dries, the film will adhere to the paint. You may notice my water dish. This is an old. Let me see. We'll move the light. It's an old CN rail ashtray, without notches, and it's on a coffee cup warmer. And now that's kind of a throwback. Back the older microscale decals, especially, and the old kit decals from my airplane days. Dave will remember the monogram stuff. They're kind of thick, and it would take a minute or two for the water to soak into the decal if the water was cold. But warm water will accelerate that reaction, and it'll go much quicker. Less of a problem with these decals, but I still do it because with warm water, you saw how quick that happened. Like that was almost instantly ready to put on the model. Saves a lot of time, because this is all about, relaxing, but I'd rather be putting decals on a model than watching them float in a puddle of water. So now I'm just working the decal around the ribs of the car with my micro brush, which is wet, and just scooching it. Because there's ribs in this car, I have to manipulate the decal to get things in position so that so that the decal is settling into the corners rather than spanning them. So that as we settle it, the decal will just be on, firmly on the surface, won't have bubbles. And I try to work as I go. I try to get it where I want it, and then work the water and air out from under it, working from the middle whenever I can. This part takes a while, especially on a large decal like this, like the noodle. This is the biggest decal that this car will get. Anything bigger than this, and on a rib side car, I'd be cutting the decal into several pieces, just because it makes it easier to manipulate. And often you'll see in decal sets, they'll actually provide little extra bits of the big decals, little extra pieces of white, for example, on this noodle, for the purpose of repairing the decal after you cut it up. A side note about selecting decals: when you're selecting a decal set, if you're putting it on a rib side car, check and make sure the decal set is intended for a rib side car, because you'll be amazed how much extra length those little ribs add up to be. If you ever, I've seen, especially, I've seen a couple times, I've seen the Athearn Husky Stack container cars, and someone has decaled them with decals intended for a Thrall car, which is rib-sided, and the noodle is extra long here and extra long here because it's got extra length to compensate for the ribs. If you have a decal that's not intended for a rib car and you want to put it on a ribbed car, that's simple enough. You figure out where it's going to land, and you put the decal on, and you use a second decal to splice together what you need to go over the ribs. Or you can touch it up with paint, but I find it more decal. The thing that looks most like a decal is another instance of the same decal. Then you don't have to worry about matching. If you want to use a rib side decal on a flat side car, reverse the process. Just figure out where it's long, cut it, splice it together. Am I making sense?
Yes, you are.
Scary. So once I got it more or less where I like it, I'm getting a little bit, it's a little high right here, but that's all right. It'll settle down. But an important part of this process is to check it to make sure that it's where it's supposed to be. So I usually just take my scale ruler and use the end of it as a square on a rib. Yeah, that's about where I like it.
Could you maybe move it a little bit closer to the camera so we can see what you're seeing?
Yep. So here's what I'm seeing. And what I'm doing is I'm just taking my scale ruler and I'm lining the end up on a rib and just making sure that it's the same distance to make sure the decal's straight and square. Yeah, I need to figure out a slightly lower mount for my camera. So once that's on, I just make sure I blot it out a little bit. If there's a lot of water, I'll take a little bit of shop towel and just place a corner near the edge of the decal, because we don't care about the water that's laying on top of the decal. We care about the water that's laying underneath it. You want to wick that out. And if you've done, most of the time, that alone will pull all the air out from under the decal, because there's water laying on the back of the decal when you take it off the paper, and it will spread out on its own underneath the decal. And it should exclude the air. If you're having difficulty with getting that to settle without getting air bubbles, you can use products like Microset. There's two types of solutions for decals. There's decal set and decal solvent. Microset is a decal setting solution. Microsol is a decal solvent. It's also Solvaset, Walther's Solvaset, which is my poison of choice for this job. You notice I didn't put decal setting solution on here. I find that the way that I work, maybe it's just something about the way I apply them. Maybe I'm just a little judicious with my clear coat, but I usually don't need a setting solution. But I do use solvent quite a bit.
What situations would need to happen before you'd want to use that setting solution?
If I had a questionable finish, like for some reason I couldn't get a nice shiny smooth gloss finish, or if it's an older decal that I've only got one shot, then I'd be using decal set. And how you use it, you just brush it on the place where the decal is going to go. And the point of it is basically to wet the surface and to soften the decal ever so slightly on the backside while still allowing it to be repositioned. Whereas what solvent does is you apply it to the edges of the decal so it wicks underneath and over the top. And what it does is it starts to dissolve the film, which bonds the decal to the paint and also shrinks it down around details. The important point with solvent is you do not want to apply solvent until you're sure you have the decal where you want it to be forever. Because once you put solvent on, you're done handling it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So you also have to be careful. We'll get to that where I'm applying it. You want to be careful you don't over apply solvent, because you don't want the beating action of the solvent itself to pull the decal out of position. That can happen.
Well,
yes?
I was just going to butt in a little bit. As a good place to use Solvaset would be if you were putting a long stripe decal, say, down the side of that box.
Microset, you mean?
Yeah, Microset is what I mean.
Yes, that would be a good chance.
It allows you to slide it, like if you're trying to line it up perfectly straight.
Yes.
I find that the Microset allows a little more time to move things around. And
and usually I do the same thing. Like you saw me applying water to the edges of the decal with my micro brush.
Yeah.
It's much the same thing.
Yeah.
And I don't do a lot of long straight line decals. So
I'm thinking more the airplane and the things like that.
Like if you're doing like the fuselage stripe on a Concorde, for example, then you'd want to, and you saw how I applied it. I held one end and pulled the paper out from underneath. That's very difficult to do with a long skinny decal.
But it's still a good way to do it.
It is a good way to do it if you can. But if you're working on if you're working in G scale, that might be more difficult.
Yeah.
So we saw that's a basic process. I'm going to move on to the next decal and show you we'll start with the cut. So as I mentioned, this decal set is printed over the top of the film, which means the entire sheet of paper has film on it. That means I have to cut close to my decal, because otherwise I'll get excessive amounts of film, which I'll have to hide later. So I'll just take a number 11 blade. Sometimes I use a number 16 scoring blade. This little fella. You see that? That's a great little blade too. But generally I just use number 11. And I try very hard to not slide the tools around on the decal sheet so I don't damage the ink. So I try to lift and reposition and place down again. I'll talk a little more about handling and storage as we go. So now it's time to put the COTS panel on. And looking at my picture to remember where it goes. Get my decal. I cannot, another important thing, a good set of tweezers. A while back, I got a deal I couldn't refuse on a pair of Dumont electronic tweezers. These things are about 30 bucks a pair regularly. I got these for $5. But I would not hesitate to pay $30 for another pair. They are very fine. They're non-magnetic. They're precision. They're made for handling small stuff like this. Whereas tweezers from the Shoppers Drug Mart, they're made for pulling cuticles and stuff. They're just not made for this. So I get my COTS
I'm
panel.
amazed at how fast that comes off the paper.
Yeah, that's, like I said, warm water. Every
Yeah.
chemical reaction accelerates when it's exposed to heat. And for years, I would fuss with it because, keeping it warm, because the water will chill pretty quickly. That small little dish of water. So I'd have like a thermos on my bench. And then when I built a purpose-built bench, I had a basin with a tap right there with hot water. But finally, what I settled on was just coffee cup heater. I saw one of those and was like, oh, well, that would be easier.
I know what I'm buying tomorrow.
I think Canadian Tire still sells them. Make sure you use a nice glass dish, though, because when you forget to turn the heater off, and you will, I did yesterday, then you won't have problems with melting anything. So this decal, this is where things get interesting, because decals often are not printed exactly to match your prototype. So there's where the handling gets fun. So here's my sheet, and you can see where the dimensional data is. Let me just point to it here. Working backwards, right there. The load limit and lightweight of this car. The problem is, let me get my picture pulled up here.
$18.99 for those, Dave, on Amazon.
I think you'll find one for $10 at Canadian Tire. I think. I looked lately because I was thinking about getting one for somebody as a gift. So let me just look at my picture here. Okay.
I might need a hot plate when I'm doing those Concord decals.
Yeah. So I'm going to just share a screen here. So here's my prototype car. So the load limit and lightweight numbers on the decal sheet, they're up here. On the prototype, they're down here. You see that? And I just as soon get that right. So I'm going to have to get a little creative. Remember we talked about handling decals and decals twisting? This is where we get into that. So I'm going to try and save the dimensional data. So I'm going to cut it.
They have those things on the Canadian Tire website, but they're none in stock anywhere.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Come on, Scott, pay attention.
So I'm cutting
in
between the data and the T block in order to treat them as separate parts. And this is where the handling can get entertaining. I give myself even money. I'll be showing you how to untangle a decal doing this one. Because decals do best when they're in big blocks. When you start getting them into little strips, they start having a mind of their own. The other advantage of thin film decals is I've got a big empty space right here that I'm going to have film that's going to have to be, blended into the car. But I don't care so much because it's quite thin and it won't be a problem. But if I don't, if I trim that away, I'm really going to have problems with twisting. So that goes there. Now, this goes here. This is where it gets fun. Oh, a note about micro brushes. change them frequently, because gradually the adhesive that is in this film will build up on the micro brush and it'll start sticking to the decal. And that's really a pain in the butt. So that. We drop
What I
it in
like to
there.
do with those micro brushes after is just pull the heads off. They make great picks for uncoupling, especially in N scale.
Yeah, but I don't need hundreds of those. I go through a lot of micro brushes. I've been on kind of a spree the last little while. This is the 4th boxcar I've decaled in the last 6 days, I think. I acquired a collection that included a lot of projects, and there were a lot of boxcars that were painted but not decaled. So I'm finishing a lot of them. So that happens there, and I'm just working. There's a big bubble underneath. Part of it's not necessarily an air bubble. Sometimes it's a water bubble, just a bead basically underneath the decal. And again, the technique is the same. Just work it out to the edges with the micro brush, and I'm drying off the micro brush a bit, blotting it on the shop towel underneath the model, so it'll soak up a little more water. If I really have a problematic decal, I'll use, my tweezers or even a dental probe to manipulate it. But I try to use that technique sparingly because that will scratch the decal. And sometimes I don't want sometimes I want to be able to read the lettering, much as my reputation for doing beat up equipment precedes me. So that just settles on. We're going to check on the first one. That's not quite dry yet. So as they dry, we'll get into the solvent. I'm very keen to make sure there's as little space as possible behind the decal on the ribs, because any gap, any span there, if it's string lines across the gap, I'm going to have to deal with. I'd rather deal with it now. It can be tricky, especially in this circumstance, because this decal, really if it's a really big gap, the only way to fix it is to move the entire decal to bring up space. But that is the basic process right there. So we're going to keep going, and we're going to do a couple more while this one dries. Let's see if this gives you any better view. Hang on. Get the little angle camera. See if that does any better for seeing what I'm doing. I'll do one this way. My gopher cam. The point of view of Al's cat. So next, we're going to grab this.
I've got a comment that that little workbench you're working on with the handles is kind of cool, where you can just grab the whole thing and.
Yeah, that's a recent evolution. I had a nice purpose-built workbench in my basement that I'm gonna have one again, but I recently had to tear everything out of that space due to a plumbing issue. So what I did was I built this because I was moving from surface to surface, like usually the dining table, sometimes even my easy chair. And I built this so even now I'm settled again at my home office desk, but this lets me just pick up whatever I'm working on, set it aside, and get to work. So it is really good.
What's the material of the
base? It's a piece of masonite.
Okay.
And I just used ripped some laths of pine around the edges and laid in a cutting mat cut to size.
Okay.
And I put a dowel across the top of the cutting mat, and then I spray adhesive some felt into that resulting recess for a tool tray.
Okay. Cool.
I call it Wild Will's Wandering Workbench.
Whoopee.
Whoopee. Though my wild days are long over. When someone calls me an armchair, someone calls me an armchair modeler, I say I built sodium chloride hoppers in my armchair. I've just got a folded up shop towel there to blot off the extra water. And you can see that's ready to apply. You're saving a minute on every decal. That adds up pretty quick. So I blot off the excess water, then find myself adding some just to gain some flotation to move the decal around without scratching it. You apply it to the, whenever you want something behind the decal, don't, if you're handling the decal, you don't put the water on top, you put it at the edge. Then it wicks underneath. The same goes for solvent. Solvent, I do put solvent on the top, but first I put it around the edges so it pulls underneath, because that's where it does the most good. How long did it take me to figure that out? I'm not going to answer that in case my high school science teacher's listening.
There's a question from Glenn Lullashore, I presume. He says, what are the handles for the workbench? To me, they look like just kitchen cupboard handles.
They are. They're drawer pulls. They were carefully selected for the important property of being the cheapest ones available. There's 2 plastic drawer pulls. And also the bottom of this is also surfaced with felt, so I can put it on any surface and it won't scratch. I wish I had done this years ago.
I can see you making those en masse and selling them at the next train show.
I have a job, thank you.
Okay.
As somebody once said in a Model Railroader article, if I did that, my hobby would become a small, struggling business, and I already have one of those. So now I'm going to grab a second decal sheet. So I'll switch cameras again. So my prototype is a CNA 412 series boxcar. So this sheet is for Canadian Nationals Trenton Works 5277. It's not quite the right car. So some of the lettering's different. No problem. Buy another decal sheet. I find I can get, 3 or 4 cars out of one set of these and 3 or 4 sets of those. And so I find is the most efficient. Oh, I'm not done with the T block yet. I find that's the most efficient way to deal with it. You will find that decaling, you'll be splicing and slicing and dicing a lot to make what you want. But the most manufacturers, Highball especially, are very generous in their sets. So they know you're going to do that. So they provide every conceivable variation of stencil that they can possibly include. Like this one includes stencils. There's like 3 and 4 versions of every stencil. Like every lock door notice, door lock instruction is 2 or 3 different ways. And they provide lots of extra numbers. That's one thing I like about them. Some manufacturers, they give you, especially the older sets, they would give you like 2 car numbers and nothing else. Highball gives you, multiple car numbers, and they give you a bunch of extra numbers. So you can mix and match for what you need. And really, it's important to find good decals for whatever you're modeling, because really most projects begin with, can I get the decals for that? You can make your own, but the limitation is that most home printers will not print white. You need a specialized printer for that. But something I recently discovered is it had never occurred to me until I stumbled across this, is that the advent of inkjet printed decals means that custom decals are far less expensive than they used to be. Back in the day, Rail Graphics would charge you, for a few sets of custom decals, you were talking at least $100 for setup because they were screened. I'm not sure what Highball charges for their custom work, but I've had some done by a Precision Design, and his rates are very reasonable. Like we had enough decals made for, I think it was 10 sets in HO. No, 12 sets in HO and 12 sets in N of decals for the orange Stay in School CB&S caboose done by PDC. And it worked out to like $6 a set. It was very reasonable. So if you want custom stuff done, I cannot recommend Bill Brillinger at Precision Design highly enough. I've also had custom placards done on my sodium chlorate project. Nobody does a placard with number 1495, which is sodium chlorate. I tried to cut and fit them together on an HO scale placard and quickly decided that I like to keep what's left of my sanity. So I called Bill Brillinger, emailed him, and I emailed him on a Wednesday. He mailed out the decals on Thursday morning, and I had them on Monday. And they were very inexpensive because he was working with existing art, so all he had to change was the number. So I need oxidizer placards, and I need 1495 as the number. No problem. Here's 2 dozen of them with the frames. And it was like $20. So
I've dealt with them myself, Will, and
Yeah.
you there's nothing bad you can say about the guy. I mean,
well, you can. It just won't be true.
amazing. Yeah, that's true. Like he's done work for me and Tim
Yeah.
Steves and a bunch of us up here. So
Yeah.
fast, cheap. Well, I wouldn't say cheap, but very economical.
Yeah. He's well worth, you're not going to get better decals for a better price.
No.
It's just not going to happen.
Well, a question has come up here is, how do you revitalize old fragile decals?
Well, that's an easy question. I don't often have to do it, but when I do, it's this stuff. Microscale liquid decal film. And you spray that on or brush it on. Spraying usually works better. Let it dry thoroughly, and it reseals the decals. I actually have had success back when I didn't have as much access to specialized hobby supplies. I would use gloss coat, Tester's gloss coat over a can, and I had success with that. It's thicker though, it makes them hard to deal with. I did that a lot with the old Eschi airplane kits. The old Eschi 148 scale line were notorious for decals that would just disintegrate as soon as they hit the water. And you could revitalize them. It is very important though to mask off the edges of the sheet. You do not want that stuff getting into the edge of the paper, because it'll seep in between the paper and the film, and then you'll have a problem. It'll just glue it down. The other thing you can do is storage. The reason I don't use it much is because I figured out decent storage at basically anywhere you buy housewares. There are the lock containers with the rubber gasket, the food tubs with the 4 locking tabs and the rubber gasket. I have a couple of those that are big enough to hold a full sheet of decals, and that's what I keep my decals in. I started with a little one, and as my decal collection grew, I went to bigger ones, and I keep my decals in there because it's airtight. It was especially important when my workbench was in the basement, which had moisture issues, and I had them down there. I have decals that sat down in a humid basement for 10 years, and they're perfect because they're in an airtight tub.
Ziploc bags would do a good.
Ziploc bags also work
Yeah.
very well. Just I didn't have a big enough Ziploc bag.
Yeah.
So now I need some stripes. Now, what did I use last time for stripes? Here we are. So I'm going to do some cannibalizing here because I need another line to go here. That doesn't include one. But it does have Helvetica font letter I, which will make my stripe. An awful lot of doing weird models like I do is getting creative with decals to get what you need. I think the kookiest solution I ever found was I was working on a model of CB&S number 5967. They're green GP9, and the herald on those, instead of having the full road name, it was initialized with periods between the initials, CB and CNS Railway. And I experimented with a couple of different things. When I finally settled on it, I realized the lettering, they used the same lettering as the other units. So, okay, I've got the letters. What about the periods? And after a lot of staring, I realized this lettering is in a font with serifs. And the serifs were round. And on the number 3, the serif on a number 3 with a round serif is a almost circular blob. So I cut the serifs off the 3s to make the periods. It was tedious, but it looked awesome when it was done. Which is kind of the story of all modelers' lives, isn't it? And that's what I'm doing here. I'm just taking this letter I, putting a couple of them together to make that.
Good when we're done.
What's that?
We're tedious and we look good when we're done.
Yep.
Okay.
I thought I'd sneak that one past you.
Means most of us aren't done, Scott.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's hard to make decal work exciting. But I find once you get the hang of the basic technique, it's and you figure out the ways to, you know, take out the parts that really aren't modeling but weighting, it becomes a lot more tolerable. And you can, you know, steam ahead. As you can see, I'm moving from one decal to the next and pretty much not waiting for things. You know, I'd like to see this dry before I do the next step, but I can just move to the other end of the car and do a bunch of other stuff. Just scrunch stuff together there. Once you get the hang of it, you find it gets easier to do the fiddly work that's associated with some of the cars you'll do. For example, changing numbers or changing dimensional data. That's sometimes not worth it and sometimes is. Just depends on what you're working with. I like to get it fairly close. Now, this decal is about ready for the next step. So I still have a little bit of spanning on this decal. I don't know if I can get it in any, but right in here, I've got a little bit of it taking the shortest route. And there comes a point where the only thing for it is to move forward and soften the decal and see if that stretches it out. And failing that, we may have to cut it. I'm going to start by softening it. So here's where Solvaset comes in. I've seen many times in hobby press and in conversations, Solvaset is great, but you have to water it down. Otherwise, it'll dissolve your decals and they'll be all blobby. I've been using Solvaset for 25 years, and I have never once put a single drop of water in it. What you do have to do is be careful how you apply it. So I'm going to get some on the brush, but not loaded. And I'm going to go around the edge first and let capillary action pull the material in. Solvaset, by the way, has been sold with various brands on it, but it always called Solvaset, but Hobsco it was one and Walthers is another. Walthers owns it now. It is all the same stuff. It's acetic acid is what it is in a mild solution. So now I'm going to go over the top of it. And the point of this is that the acetic acid will attack the film. This was it gives a much bigger difference. I'll do this one while I'm here. On screen printed decals, because they had the film over the top of the ink, and the effect was much more drastic. It would, you know, dissolve the film and just leave the ink behind. after several applications. But with inkjet printed decals, it still does work. It still softens the film and allows it to settle into the paint and around details, and it will give you a much nicer finish. So once it's on, I'm not touching that anymore. But I can keep working up here. And that's how I tend to work, is in sections for that reason. So I can, okay, these decals have got Solvaset on them. I'll leave them alone. I'll do some more applications up here and so on.
Guess you could always have another boxcar on the go too.
You can, if you're doing an assembly line. I was doing a batch of pulpwood cars a few years back, and I was building 10 of them. So in that case, I just, and especially as a bulkhead flat car, so there isn't much of an area to work with there. So I just do one side of one car, set it aside, do the next car, and so on. And by the time I'd done all 10, I'd flip over the first one and work back through the stack and just work through them all. So as that, sorry?
I was just going to say, with regards to the Solvaset, I didn't realize that Walther's had it now, and I couldn't find it for years, and I had run out. So I got into Tamiya. Tamiya makes a line of
yes, they do.
three different grades.
Yep.
And I find them really good.
Yeah, the setting solution I think contains a little bit of acetic acid. I think it's a much milder solution, but this stuff is the higher strength. And Solvaset was known for years, in comparison to Microsol, as being the high test stuff.
Yep.
And Tamiya makes, like you said, multiple strengths, and really they all do the same thing. They soften the decal and they bring it down into the finish and unify it. So while that starts to set up, I'll talk about the next step, which we're not going to do live for obvious logistical reasons. So once the decal is on, now you got to seal it. So I've already done the other side of this car. Let me show you what it looks like. We'll turn it right side up. So that's the finished car, and you can see just a faint, that side, a faint outline around that of the residue of the film. There have been several applications of Solvaset there, and it's snuggled in really nice, but there's still a light bit of film showing. That usually isn't a problem as long as there isn't much of it, and as long as you've got a good finish around it. There's two ways to seal decals. It just depends on which model I'm working on. This car, this is scale coat paint, which has a nice gloss finish. The decals will snuggle down really nicely, and I've experimented with this. So this car, I will just shoot a coat of dull coat right over the decals, and that will fade out the film. It'll homogenize that finish and make it look okay, and it'll of course kill the shine. If I've got a car that I've clear coated with a gloss clear coat over the paint, what I will do is, after the decals have set thoroughly, I will overcoat with the gloss coat again. And the point of that is to provide an even finish across the top. So the decals and the previous clear coat are laying under a layer of clear coat. So when that sets and I hit it with flat finish, the flat finish is, as far as it's concerned, it's over a uniform coat of gloss, and the reflectance will be the same across the model. And what that will do is it will prevent any ghosting of the film around it. Because sometimes, depending on the paint, depending on the finish, when you hit with dull coat, what you'll find is that the dull coat will dull the film of the decal to a different degree than it dulls the paint, and it'll stand out.
Right.
As my dear old dad would say, like a tin outhouse in the fog. If any of you have any idea what that means, I'm all ears, but that's what he said. He may not have said outhouse, but so yeah, if I was painting this model from scratch, I only use acrylics, so I would be hitting it with pledge, decaling it, more pledge. As one of the commenters said, wash off excess solution if you need to, more pledge. So you got a nice even finish, then the flat coat over that.
Actually, talking about solutions, Chris Lyon asks, where there is a residual left after using solutions, do you use water to clean the top before the clear coat?
I do. If I'll examine the finish before I go further, and if it looks like there's some residue, it'll show up. You'll see it. There'll be little tracks of it, kind of like hard water tracks. And if I see that, then I'll grab a micro brush and some clean water and just rub it out.
Actually, talking about hard water, I'm going to butt in here again. I just found out and started using distilled water as my Decals water.
Absolutely.
And
I have done that, but I find that the tap water I have here is not very hard, and it just doesn't cause issues.
Yeah.
I still, if I'm thinning paint with water, I'll use distilled.
Okay.
But for decals, I don't find. But if you do have issues with watermarks, absolutely, just get some distilled water from the pharmacy, and away you go. Because you're going to heat it up in the dish anyway.
Yeah. Warms up the same way.
Yep. As long as you don't warm it up too much and get hydrogen. So I don't know if you can see that. The Solvaset is doing its job on this decal. I'll go to the other camera because that's a manual focus camera. You can see it's starting to crinkle a little bit. See that little roughness? That's usually when people panic. But that's part of the process. That just means that it's softened. The decal is softened and it's kind of finding its own level. And it will take more than one application usually to get it really the way you want it. Especially if you're doing something like an underpaint. Like I did a model of a helm leasing unit that had been painted for Seaboard system, and they just patched over the Seaboard herald, but they hadn't done a very good job, so you could still read it. So I basically painted the locomotive for Seaboard system, then patched it like the railroad did. So I used like 7 or 8 applications of Solvaset because I wanted to be certain that decal was dead on there before I overcoated it with more paint. I didn't want any bubbles and blisters. It very much is, decaling is very much a patience thing. You can speed it up a little bit with various tricks, but ultimately you've got to, sit back and look at it, make sure you got what you want. That doesn't sound like mute to me.
So somebody forgot the mute button.
That's the basics of doing decals. I mean, you can sit here and watch me apply more decals, but the process is going to look exactly the same. For a preview of what the finished product looks like, this side is ready for clear coat. I actually was going to clear coat it, and I just didn't get it done today. So that side is ready, and one end has been done. And somebody said something very profound lately on one of the modeling groups. They said, there you go. End lettering on freight cars is the model railroad equivalent of eat your vegetables. You got to do it. You may not like it. One thing, actually, that brings me to another point. When you're picking a prototype, unless you're stuck on a very specific car, you can often save yourself a lot of headache by looking carefully at the decal sheet and seeing which numbers are next to each other. So I'm doing 412735. The decals I'm working with did not have 412735, but they did have 412233 and 417352. Well, I've got a 412, I've got a 735. That means those pesky end decals amounted to 3 decals instead of 10. Especially on those ends. I hate doing those. So those are the basics of applying Waterslide decals. I mean, I could go on for as long as you like. I'm on vacation. I'll happily take
vacation for how much time?
What's that? I'm on vacation for 2 weeks from yesterday. And besides, I work from home. So
there you go. Anybody else have any questions? If you do, you can turn on your microphone and we can have a conversation.
Yeah, please do.
If you have your camera off, you can turn it on if you want to. I'm not going to force people to, but it is nice to see everybody, especially after the months and months of isolation that we've had.
Because, you know, everybody knows I love talking about this stuff.
So I'm going to cancel your spotlight there, Will. Maybe not. There we go.
Be my guess.
Do you try to keep the room warm or use a bit of higher wattage light bulb to heat the area up over top where you're working?
Nope. My workbench lights are LED.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I just don't worry about it. Oh, that wasn't what I wanted.
I'm going to cancel your spotlight there, Will. Okay, somebody's watching on Facebook at the same time.
One interesting mistake I made one time with Tamiya decal setting solution is it's the same kind of bottles as they put their glue in.
Yep.
Except different color caps, of course.
Mhm.
So I wasn't paying all that close attention, so I grabbed the glue and put it on some of the decal. And it worked really good.
Oh, yes.
But I was able to salvage it. But
Yep.
what I did kind of learn was that in a real situation, I do use just a little tiny bit of glue to get around a really big dip or whatever. When something just will not lay down, just ever so slight touch of glue will definitely make it lay down.
Well, when you mentioned that, remember I mentioned, you know, not having access to specialized stuff when I was in my formative years. I couldn't, you know, I didn't know. I knew that decal solvent was a thing, but every time I went to the hobby shops in Truro and Halifax, which, you know, we're talking 2 to 3 hours from home, they would have testers decal set, and that was it. So in a couple of instances of the aforementioned old monogram decals that were really thick, I would apply the tiniest bit of testers liquid plastic cement, and it would work. But it was kind of an ultimate horror weapon solution. It was like, again, it requires a certain level of commitment to your placement of that decal. and to, you know, it's the decal is not going to solvent. It's not going to have work as well. Like some of the distortion of the decal will be permanent. At least I found. It does do it. And I still have occasionally broken that out where something odd has happened with the finish, and I'm trying to get that decal to settle, and it just won't. I was like, okay, get the double aught brush and the tiniest bit of MEK. I got to be careful with that now, though, because I don't use testers anymore. I use 100% MEK. Testers is only 30% MEK. So it's really hot. So got to be careful with that. Miss Carol will be joining my, oh, there you go. Eventually, this car will be joining my fleet of paper cars. This is actually the Athearn Genesis Seco 50-foot box car with an MDC 10-foot plug door in it to replicate the cars that CN bought secondhand from TTX. The first batch got new doors, and then they painted the door, and the rest of the car was still in TTX yellow. And they patched them out. And then a few years later, they painted the rest of the car, but, well, they had already painted the door, so why bother? Hence the coloration.
When I was up in Ottawa, I would go over quite a bit to Tommy Hood's place. He was the fellow that owned the CDS Dry Transfer Company.
Yep.
And he religiously applied his CDS Dry Transfers to decal film, and then put a solution over the top, and then basically treat them as a decal in order for them to fit in some of the older cars.
Yeah, I used to do that when I was modeling CN. I cornered the market on CDS set number 212, which is the CN safety stripes, and I would apply it to a sheet of I'd apply several to a sheet of microscale decal film and clear coat them, because, you know, dry transfer around an EMD traction motor blower housing just does not work.
Right.
And I don't want to throw shade on. I started out with saying, you know, I'm not here to talk about dry transfers, just because they're a different process.
Sure.
I mean, if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for CDS, modeling Canadian prototypes would have been impossible for a
Yeah.
lot of us.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I applied lots of them in the 80s and the early 90s, you know, and past that, because that was the decals I could get.
Yep.
And now I don't use them much, but I still have some, you know, and
Mhm.
for some, I got some St. Lawrence and Atlantic ones, and I've got some, what are the other ones? I think I've got Hudson Bay Railway ones here. I have no idea why I have those. Just, they were in Jack McCory's box, and I thought they were neat.
Northern
No.
Alberta Railway, they have really nice ones.
Yeah. And, you know, they still have a place, and they do have the advantage of, you know, they're a dry process,
Mhm.
so a little easier to do. You can dispense with the initial clear coat, because, you know, most model paints are flat color, flat finish, and CDS decal dry transfers work best on a flat finish anyway. And there's no residual film around them. It's just straight ink on the paint. So when you clear coat it, there's no worry about ghosting.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a process available to convert wet process decals into dry transfers. All I know about it is that in a photo caption, in a model of the month article in Fine Scale Modeler in about 1987, somebody had done this on a model. That's all I know. And they got letters about how does that work? You know, how do you do that? And they never answered it.
Was it an April issue?
No, it was not. No, it was not. Nice try. I got up for a reason. Oh yes, Tubbs.
So
We're at that age now, Will, where we get up and go into a room and then can't remember what we went there for.
I did just turn 50.
so Will, a question: do you airbrush the clear coat on, or just
Yes.
brush it?
I airbrush it on. I used to use rattle cans of dull coat, but now I just use I buy bottles. Now, I did that because I couldn't reliably get bottles of dull coat that hadn't congealed so badly on the bottom that they didn't give you a flat finish. And once in a while, I use Bob Morrison's technique of spraying the spray bomb into an airbrush jar. But lately, I found I can get better batches of dull coat, and just in the tall square bottle, and just I put that in the color cup of my airbrush, just unthinned, and airbrush it on.
Is it the type
Really?
that it sets up in the bottom and and you have to tell you not to take it, right?
You got to shake it for a couple minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
If there's anything sitting in the bottom, it's not ready yet. Keep on shaking. And if it won't, if no amount of shaking will make it mix evenly, throw out the bottle. But I haven't seen a bad bottle like that in quite some time. I mentioned the containers. Here's the container I use. So this is like a, I don't know, 8x12 lock and lock tub. Got a nice rubber gasket around the lid. Locks down, holds lots of decals. I actually have one for sets that I'm using and one for all the leftovers. So, you know, oh crap, I ruined this decal. Do I have another one of those? I go to the other tub and start rummaging.
Getting back to your dull coat.
Yeah.
You say you airbrush that on unthinned?
Yeah. I just dump it in the color cup. I have a color cup I use a Badger 200 NH for my clear coats. And I have a color cup from a Badger 350. Now, when you buy that, when you look for that, shop for that on the website, Badger will say, you know, for the 350 only. Yeah, well, it works perfectly great on a 200. I've been using it for years. So I just pour some into the color cup, put it on the airbrush, and spray.
I just thin mine with lacquer thinner.
Yeah, I don't thin it. I haven't had a problem. Now, if I was running an older style brush with the finer needles, like the old 200, I would have to thin it. You'd have to thin it. But I find with the newer brushes that are set up for acrylics with those nice high flow heads, like the 200 NH and the 105, you don't need to. Sorry?
I'm a patch airbrush guy.
Yeah. And I'm just running straight air from a gassed medical compressor. It's maybe 15 psi. I get asked that once in a while, what pressure do you use? Whatever pressure comes out of a 1/8 horsepower gas medical compressor.
You mentioned using Pledge for clear coat. Is that's not the can of Pledge for cleaning?
No.
furniture.
Pledge floor finish.
It used to be called Future.
Future, exactly. And every now and again, this will come up in groups and forums, and usually there's a discussion about, you know, oh, it's floor wax. It'll turn yellow. It's not wax. What it is clear acrylic gloss.
Yes.
And it's been right under our noses since the 80s. It's something I learned from airplane modeling back in the 80s. Fine Scale Modeler was my go-to modeling magazine back then, because it was easier to get a subscription to that than it was to get a subscription to Model Railroader for logistical reasons. And, you know, they've been using it since it came out. Airplane guys have been using it since it came out. The one thing I find with it is the best finish I get is when I do a light coat, let it dry a bit, then follow with a heavier coat to get the gloss. And the light coat will kind of pebble, and you'll think you've ruined it. But
Tooth. It gives you tooth.
Yeah, gives you tooth, and then the flood coat will give you the shine.
The same Future is what I used in all my water effects for harbors and stuff. Just brushed it on.
Yep.
Painted areas, and it's easy to, you know, after a few years, if things are getting scratched or anything, you just plain paint on some more, and away you go.
I use all kinds of stuff. Like I wanted to preserve a coin. I had polished up nicely. I put a coat of Future on it. Now it won't oxidize. Yeah, think outside the box sometimes. You got to think about the essentials of what you're trying to do really are. You know, what am I trying to do? I'm not trying to gloss coat a model. I'm trying to apply a transparent glossy finish. Where can I get one of those? As I said, it's incredibly thin, so it'll just fly through the airbrush. So you do have to, you know, do a little practicing, but it doesn't take long to get the hang of using it.
But Will,
Yeah.
question: I use enamel paint, or could I still put acrylic clear on it?
Oh yes, you can put. You have to watch out for reactions usually with enamels and lacquers against other things. Acrylics are pretty much inert. They won't cause a reaction with something else under them, but something else over them might be a problem.
Thanks.
Although
apparently dull coat, you can put dull coat over the Future, not a problem.
yes, you can. Yes, dull coat doesn't have a problem. And again, you test it, you learn. There are other things like I found out years and years ago was when I used Testors enamels extensively, the old square bottles, Testors enamel flat black in the little square bottles did not like dull coat one little bit. If you shot it with dull coat, it turned white. Just like if you shot the dull coat with alcohol. Something about, and it was specifically Testors PLA enamel flat black. And it was worst if you had brushed it with a brush. If you'd airbrushed it, you might get away with it. But if you'd hand brushed it, no way. It happened every time.
Some wise ass person on Facebook wants to know if you're using Decals or Decals.
I'm using Decals from the process known as decalcomania. Are they really picking a fight with me about words?
So
really?
I'll just say,
They have not
there
met
you
me.
go, Bruce. Now you know.
They have not met me, have they?
Yes,
although normally this is a sort of pedantic nonsense up with which I will not put.
And you are using a Medical compressor.
A Medical compressor. There you go. Rick Hamilton says, don't spray alcohol over dull coat.
Not if you don't want it to look chalky, no. If you hit rubbing alcohol over dull coat, that's actually a great technique for modeling a galvanized metal roof on a freight car. Is you dull coat whatever color you painted it, like silver or chrome or whatever your preference is, and then hit it with dull coat or the alcohol. It will give this nice chalking effect to represent the galvanizing. And that's a Mike Rose technique. You can use just I think Mike Rose uses a spritzer bottle with alcohol. I use an airbrush because the airbrush is right there. What's
If you
that?
make that mistake and you do spray alcohol over it,
Just
you
pour
can
coat.
put dual coat over it again, and apparently it disappears.
Yeah, it does.
I
I did that.
discovered that I was
yeah.
weathering a freight car, and
Yeah.
I was using alcohol as a thinner for something,
Yep.
to simulate something. I forget what it was, but whenever it dried, it was all kind of chalky white.
Yeah.
But it looked
And you-
kind of like things were faded. So
Yeah.
I kind of like it.
You can get a nice fade that way. I had that happen weathering, and I was using weathering powders, I think, and I was using alcohol as a thinner for them, and everything started turning white, and I'm like, oh yeah,
Oh yeah.
let this dry, dull coat it again, and pressed on. It's like, don't do that. But yes, you can get a nice chalk paint effect. I don't have a picture of it handy. I did a Boston and Maine boxcar a while back, and that's how I chalked out the paint. I dull coated it and airbrushed it with alcohol to get a more muted effect. And it turned out beautifully. Because, that Boston and Maine crap never looks good anyway. Did you get that, Bruce?
He hasn't replied on Facebook yet.
He will.
He
I
did
got him.
say ha to the Decals decals thing.
Yeah. I've got him muted on Facebook Messenger. So before I started this, I muted Rick, I muted Taylor, I muted Chris.
So that's why they're all here. Okay.
Yes.
Watching the video over there.
Well, I muted them on my Facebook Messenger so they wouldn't be pinging me the entire time.
One thing I want to say, Douglas Margison, I really like the sign you created for your train station. If anybody hasn't seen it on Facebook, it's an animated sign. You can see a still image of it behind him there as his background. Yeah. It'll show the correct time, and it'll announce trains arriving and departing and all that sort of stuff. It's a pretty neat little thing. It's a tiny. How big would it be, Douglas? How big in size?
Well, it's sort of a bit less than an inch long, and probably about half an inch tall. It's a little bit bigger than, if you were going to sort of try to stick it out from the wall here, it'd do probably better with ON30.
It's a little too big for that.
But you wind up that if I, so it's a little bit big for HO scale. But on the other hand, I wanted something that was readable, and it's something too that in between. So I have a morning schedule. The station comes alive at 7:30, train departs at 8:05. It sort of goes to sleep until about 8:30 at night, which is about 2 hours and 55 minutes after the whole thing starts. And at that point, in between, the switcher, the engineer for the switcher can sort of look at things and tell him when the next train's departing or arriving. And so it's sort of I'm trying to use it for the both the passenger train and to assist the yard switcher.
Okay, so it works. You're using it kind of like a fast clock.
Yeah, it does. So, but and it takes essentially 3 hours and 12 minutes to get through a 15-hour day.
It's really cool. Warning, Will. Warning. Bruce has arrived on Zoom.
Yeah, my mutes just expired. So you may have noticed me working with the knife here. In these corners here with this big decal, I'm just slicing the film all the way across, and I'll apply a little more Solvaset, and that'll let the decal settle finally into its final location. So you don't have these little tents of decal on the edges of the ribs.
Will,
Hello.
what is your Solvaset bottle sitting in? It doesn't move. What have you got it sitting in?
That is a 1.5 inch plumbing pipe test cap, screwed down to the bench.
Okay, thank
And
you.
it just, all it does is it moves, but it keeps it from falling over.
Okay, thank you.
You can make them out of wood too. I've got one here.
Yeah.
they save you a day. It's better than spreading it around your workplace.
Oh, if I had a nickel for every bottle of Solvaset, I've only gotten to use half of.
I got tons of them.
I get to use the bottom half of the bottle. The top half gets slopped onto the bench. And just because, you know, it wasn't bad enough, Walter's got a new bottle which has a wider mouth.
There you go.
I bought these that look pretty good. They're different size bottles also.
Same idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just incorporated one into my little wandering. Like I said, if I'm working on a model and I'm not done yet, I want to use the desk or the dining table, I just take it and
I have
pick it up and
little
move it.
narrow ones over here on my desk, and I keep my glue bottles upside down so that when I need some glue onto a piece of paper or something, I'm not squeezing and shaking like crazy.
That tacky glue takes forever. It's like waiting for ketchup.
Yeah. I guess leave it like this all the time.
Yeah. Great stuff, though.
I'm gonna have to break out my Forstner bits and make some of those boards up, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, people, I've noticed that people tend to be increasingly timid about painting and decaling, and really it's not black magic. It's just, you know, it's a process you got to get a handle on. And once you know it, you know it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to look for additional resources on how to do that kind of thing, model airplane guys, they know everything about making decals look like they're painted on. Also, NASCAR modelers are great at it and getting a nice shiny finish. Similarly, if you're looking for, you know, if you're looking for weathering, in particular rust effects on sharp angled shapes, go talk to the armor modelers. Look what they're doing. And you know, even the miniature painters or the Warhammer guys, they have their own techniques, and some of them transfer nicely, some of them don't. The shadow effects that the armor guys do, they don't translate as well to trains because they're modeling it as if the sun is the light source in a particular position, and we have a moving light source because they're a live model, I call them. But a lot of the other stuff they do, like the highlights and the highlights they do to bring out the edges of parts, those are very valid. And that's really, you know, I'm always stealing ideas. You know,
Okay. Anybody else with questions for Will? We're just about to the hour-and-a-half mark. So,
well, Scott, I'm pretty impressed because I'm not that patient when it comes to decals.
Me too. That's why I do this.
Hello.
Yeah. But say he's patient, really patient. It's good.
Yeah, a good teacher.
It's you know, like I said, this is not complex work. It's just you have to learn
I
it.
think the best part of this whole presentation is we only had about 10 minutes where we actually saw Will's face.
You're welcome.
There were no laugh. Hey,
man.
I got a point there, Derwin.
People occasionally tell me that I've got a radio voice. Yeah, I've also got a radio face.
Yeah.
I got a face made for radio.
Kind of like somebody else in the top corner there, Mr. Henry.
Thank God.
Yeah, don't forget to take your Optivisor off before you go to bed.
Yeah, I participate in a couple of Zoom calls that happen every week, and one of them is you know, you look at the gallery of video feeds, and it's a forest of Optivisors. Dork vision activate. You know, the young guys make fun of the guys that are wearing them. It's like, yeah, just you wait, Junior.
Yeah, you'll be here someday too.
Yeah, it's the Optivisor is, you know, as all us old guys know, it becomes an essential tool.
Oh, to be 50 again.
Oh, to be 70 again.
Yeah, I know.
Gentlemen, Gentlemen, my bedtime's coming up, so I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much for letting me attend. I really appreciate it. Bob's good talking with you again.
And Rob, I guess you do get the prize for coming the farthest.
I guess I do.
Yes.
I am probably the furthest member of the MFMR that you have.
No,
Where are
well, I don't know if Al, is Gordy still a member?
Give me a minute. I can tell you.
Gordy Robinson was a member, and he's.
Oh, okay. Well, then he trumps me.
There you
Where
go.
are you?
But you can travel by land, Rob.
Where's Rob located?
Car up
This
again
is true.
anytime to see us.
You're where, Rob? Where are you located?
Staten Island, New York. Actually, I have to cross water before I get to there anyway. A number of times.
Yeah, my weekly call actually has a bunch of guys from New York.
Ah, okay.
Very good. Thanks for joining us, Rob.
Thanks,
Yes.
Rob.
Thanks.
Good
Pleasure.
to see you, bro.
Thanks Happy again. holidays. Yeah, Merry Christmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas.
Well, thanks very much for an informative session.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening to me yammer. And I if you bump into me anywhere, there's nothing I like more than sharing what I know, what I've learned. I've encountered a few modelers that I've asked for advice, not many that have been stingy with what they've learned. This information is only useful if other people have it. So we'll do it all again. Yep. Can I put a plug in for an event?
No.
Come on.
No.
On January 9th.
That's pretty good.
On January 9th, there is another, I think it's the 5th edition of the online RPM meets that have been going on. It's called Hindsight 2020, and it's a bunch of clinics on modeling, on prototype operations, layout tours, freight car building, the works. It's run by a couple of guys based in New York State and in Hamilton. And it's a really great event. There are hundreds of guys join it. And on January 9th, starting at 1 p.m. Atlantic time, and it goes on until about 9 p.m. Half-hour clinics, short shots. I'm doing one on modeling scrap gondolas on the cheap. And it's, if you go to speedwitchmedia.net, that's SPEEDWITCH, you look on there for Hindsight 2020. It's done through Zoom. You do have to register to get the Zoom link, but there's no charge. And it's a really great thing. Like the last one, I put it on the computer and I just sat in the library here and did a bunch of other stuff and listened to the presentations, and they were just amazing. So if you've got some time to kill on that date, I recommend it very highly.
Very good. And
Maybe you could
Greg
post
will
that
this, but
on
he's
the website, Will.
What's that?
Maybe you could post that on the website.
Yeah.
yeah, I can put it on the in with the video in the comments part.
Okay, if you could do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
That'd be useful.
Like I did with the last one there. I put the links up over top.
Yeah.
I can do that with this, and I'll put it on the page as well on the MFMR website.
I have another question maybe somebody can help me with. I'm going to be starting to work on a resin boat, and it has some smooth sides to it. And I know you all about the cleaning of it so that paint will adhere, but do any of you sand the surfaces to give it some tooth before you put an undercoat on it?
I don't sand, but I will grip blast it with baking soda. I did a Caslow transfer van a couple of years ago that I rescued from Rick's garbage can, and the only thing I found that worked, like to say that I had cleaned it meticulously would be a gross understatement.
Right.
But what finally got paint to stick on the 4th try was I put it in the blasting booth and grip blasted it, and that gave the material tooth. It seems to depend upon the age of the resin.
Yeah.
The older the resin, it seems like it weeps out some chemistry that interferes with paint adhesion, and the act of grip blasting it seems to remove that surface or something and give it tooth. But even so, you got to be very careful with your masks.
Sure.
Like even after I'd rescued it and fixed it, that thing almost got a Viking funeral.
Don't breathe the stuff.
No,
Uh,
don't breathe resin dust.
Rick is correcting you that it was a Sylvan.
Oh, did I say Casla? Yes, he's right. I suck.
Well, that
You're right,
Castle
you
seems to
do.
have some kind of a release chemical that you can't seem to get rid of.
Yeah, I mean, they sell their resin prep, which is rebottled Goo Gone, is what it is,
Yeah.
citrus-based solvent. But you know, I've tried combinations of that of the resin prep that Sylvan sells, Goo Gone, rubbing alcohol, Comet. What else? Dish detergent, but in varying combinations. And the thing that worked was meticulously cleaning it with dish detergent, then with rubbing alcohol to remove any residue from the dish detergent, and then grip blasting it, rinsing it one more time, and then paint stuck to it. You know, but some resin, not all resins like that. Like the harder resins, like the stuff Caslo. There, I did mean to say Caslo. Like they use, I've had much less difficulty getting that to stick.
Yeah, this one's a Frenchman River ship that I'm going to work on.
Yeah, I don't know about those.
I have a couple of those, Chris, and I didn't find I had that much difficulty getting paint to stick to it. And I just used acrylic.
Yeah.
Okay. That's great news.
Yeah.
Maybe start with a shot of Tamiya primer.
Yeah.
That stuff sticks to everything.
Primers here. I really like the stuff that Citadel makes, the Warhammer stuff.
Oh yeah.
They have a really fine primer. They're great.
Really? I haven't tried Citadel primer. I use Tamiya generally.
It's just that it's made for detailed figures and stuff like that. There's no grain in it at all.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's a good thought.
Over in Halifax at the
Games Workshop.
The Games Workshop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been in there for figure painting stuff, and it never occurred to me.
They've come out with a whole new line of that primer, mainly because they've been using the contrast paints, and people have been applying that right over primer, and it allows the color from underneath to come through, so it has to be pretty smooth.
Yeah. Yeah, those guys know a lot about detail painting.
They do.
I've done some for our D&D group, and I've probably done a couple dozen figures. I wouldn't call myself a very good figure painter, especially having seen the stuff that what's the guy's name at Hecatina. What he does is amazing.
There's a British guy online. His name is Hobby. Well, it's on YouTube. It's called Hobby Cheats, and he has an extraordinary approach to a lot of this fine miniature modeling, but he uses very common products instead of the high-end stuff.
Yeah.
And so he's really worth having a look at if you've got the time, because a lot of it's transferable to model railroad type things. It's just called Hobby Cheat.
Okay, folks, I guess we'll call her quits for tonight. And I'm going to stop the